Woman left stunned upon entering nursing home. What she found inside left everyone speechless. The sun had barely risen when Kate Ross rushed into the Meadows parking lot, her car skidding on the loose gravel. She glanced at her watch and cursed under her breath she was late on her first day as the director of the nursing home. As she hurried to the entrance, her mind flashed back to the previous week. The bitter taste of divorce still fresh, her bags thrown into the car, her son Ethan sleeping in the back seat. The desperate escape from Portland, leaving behind a life that had crumbled. Kate pushed open the front door, expecting a warm reception. Instead, she was greeted by a disturbing silence and a musty smell. She looked around, confused. Where was everyone? "Hello," she called out, her voice echoing through the empty hallways. Finally, a nurse appeared, looking as surprised as Kate. "Oh, you must be the new director," the nurse said without enthusiasm. "Welcome to the Meadows." Kate followed the nurse, her eyes wide with shock. The walls needed fresh paint, the carpet was stained, and she could swear she saw a rat scurrying into a corner. "What happened here?" Kate asked, horrified. The nurse shrugged. "Lack of funds, lack of staff. You know how it is." Kate didn't, but she was about to find out. As they walked, Kate noticed a lone figure through a dirty window. An elderly woman stood in the middle of what must have once been a beautiful garden, now nothing but weeds and dry soil. "Who is that?" Kate asked. "Oh, that's Evelyn Winters. She tends to have these moments." Kate watched as Evelyn spoke to the dead plants, caressing the wilted leaves as if they were old friends. "She needs help," Kate said, already moving toward the door. "Good luck with that," the nurse muttered. Outside, the air was heavy and hot. Kate approached Evelyn carefully. "Hello, Mrs. Winters. I'm Kate, the new director." Evelyn looked at her, her blue eyes clouded with confusion. "Have you seen my daisies? They were here yesterday." Kate looked around, seeing only weeds. "I'm sure we'll find them," she said gently. Suddenly, Evelyn grabbed Kate's arm. "You need to water them. They'll die." Kate nodded, feeling a lump in her throat. "We'll take care of them together, okay?" After calming Evelyn and bringing her back inside, Kate finally reached her office. Piles of papers covered the desk, and a folder marked urgent caught her attention. She opened the folder and felt her stomach sink. Unpaid bills, service cutoff notices, and a letter from the board of directors. The words leaped off the page, imminent risk of closure. Kate sank into her chair, the reality of her situation weighing down on her like a crushing burden. What had she done? Why did she think she could run a nursing home? Hours passed in a blur of frustrating meetings and disheartening discoveries. As the sun began to set, Kate found herself back in her office, exhausted and demoralized. She picked up the phone, her fingers hovering over the numbers. It would be so easy to call her old life, beg for her job back, admit she had made a terrible mistake. But then she remembered the look in Evelyn's eyes, the loneliness and confusion. The sorry state of the Meadows and the people depending on it. With a deep sigh, Kate put the phone back on the hook. She had made a choice, and now she had to live with it. For better or worse, this was her new beginning. As she closed up the office, Kate took one last look through the window. In the withered garden, a single daisy bud struggled to open, stubborn and resilient against all odds. Kate smiled for the first time that day. Maybe, just maybe, there was hope for the Meadows after all. Kate was determined to make changes at the Meadows, and she decided to start with the garden. On a sunny morning, she gathered the staff outside, armed with shovels, seeds, and an optimistic smile. "Let's transform this place," she announced, pointing towards the neglected ground. The response was not what she expected. The employees exchanged skeptical looks. "With what money?" asked Sarah, a middle-aged nurse. "We barely have enough for medications." Kate swallowed hard. "Well, we'll start with what we have. I'm sure the community will help us." The murmurs of disbelief continued, but Kate was undeterred. She grabbed a shovel and started digging, determined to lead by example. Gradually, a few employees joined her. The work was hard, but Kate felt they were making progress. What she didn't know was that at night, a solitary figure emerged into the garden. Evelyn Winters, with her wrinkled hands and hunched back, worked under the moonlight. She planted, watered, and cared for the young seedlings with a love only an experienced gardener could have. Each morning, Kate was surprised by how much the garden had progressed overnight. She attributed this to the growing enthusiasm of the staff, unaware of Evelyn's secret. A week after the project began, the Meadows received an unexpected visit. Jack Sullivan, the young local pastor, arrived with a forced smile and a Bible under his arm. Kate greeted him at the entrance. "Pastor Sullivan, welcome." "What a pleasant surprise." Jack looked uncomfortable, his eyes restless. "Thank you, Mrs. Ross. I came to see how the residents are doing." As they walked through the corridors, Kate noticed Jack's tense manner. He spoke to the elderly, but his words seemed rehearsed, his smile never reaching his eyes. In the garden, they found Evelyn sitting on a bench, admiring the new seedlings. Jack approached her. "Mrs. Winters, how are you today?" "God bless you." Evelyn looked at him, confused. "Who are you, young man?" Jack appeared disconcerted. "I'm Pastor Sullivan, remember? I come here every week." Kate intervened gently. "Evelyn has good days and bad days, Pastor. Today seems to be a difficult one." Jack nodded, clearly relieved to move on. Kate followed him to the exit. "Pastor Sullivan," she began, "I appreciate your visits, but..." "But what?" he asked defensively. Kate hesitated. "Well, maybe we could find more practical ways to help the residents. Something beyond prayers." Jack tensed up. "Are you suggesting that faith isn't important, Mrs. Ross?" "No, of course not," Kate backtracked. "I just thought. I believe I know what's best for the residents' spiritual well-being," Jack interrupted coldly. "Excuse me." He left hurriedly, leaving Kate frustrated and confused. Later that day, while Kate worked in her office, an unwanted memory invaded her mind. She saw herself back in Portland, 5 years ago. Kate stood at the doorway of her mother's hospital room. Catherine, once vibrant and full of life, was now frail and confused due to Alzheimer's. "Gracie, is that you?" Catherine called, her voice weak. Kate felt panic rise. She couldn't do this. She couldn't see her mother like this, couldn't take care of her. It was too much. With tears in her eyes, Kate stepped back. Then another step. And another. Until she was running down the hallway, fleeing the hospital, fleeing from her mother. The guilt consumed her as she returned to the present. Kate wiped away a stray tear, determined not to let the past control her. A noise at the door brought her back to reality. It was Ethan, her 10-year-old son. "Mom, you have to see this," he exclaimed, pulling her by the hand. Kate followed him to the garden, where she found Ethan and Evelyn sitting together, laughing. Evelyn was showing Ethan how to plant seeds. "Look, Mom. Mrs. Evelyn is teaching me how to be a gardener." Kate smiled, touched by the scene. But then she noticed something in Evelyn, a distant look, a shadow of sadness. "Are you okay, Evelyn?" Kate asked gently. Evelyn blinked, returning to the present. "Oh, yes, dear. I just remembered, well, it doesn't matter now." Kate wanted to ask more, but Evelyn had already turned her attention back to Ethan, teaching him about the different flowers. Watching the two, Kate felt a mix of emotions. Joy at seeing her son connect with Evelyn, but also a twinge of concern. What had caused that shadow in Evelyn's eyes? As the sun set, Kate reflected on the day's events. The garden was coming to life, but there were still many secrets and challenges to face at the meadows. And as the shadows of night fell, Evelyn prepared for another secret session of gardening, her hands eager to care for the new lives sprouting from the earth. One morning, Kate arrived early at the meadows and was surprised to find Evelyn already in the garden. The elderly woman's hands moved with surprising dexterity among the plants. "Evelyn," Kate called softly, not knowing she was so good with plants. Evelyn smiled, her eyes lighting up with a clarity that Kate rarely saw. "Oh, dear, I was a florist for over 40 years. These hands know every flower and every leaf." Kate sat beside her, fascinated. "Tell me more about it." As Evelyn spoke about her old flower shop, the colors and scents that filled her days, Kate realized she was seeing a completely new side of the elderly woman. She wasn't just a confused resident, but a woman with a rich and full life. "You know," Evelyn said, her voice growing distant, "I used to make the most beautiful bridal bouquets. Caroline always said she wanted me to make hers one day." Kate froze. It was the first time she heard Evelyn mention a daughter. "Caroline? Who is Caroline, Evelyn?" But the moment of lucidity had passed. Evelyn blinked, confused, and went back to tinkering with the plants without answering. Later that day, Kate was watering some seedlings when she saw Pastor Jack approaching. He looked tired, with deep circles under his eyes. "Hello, Pastor Sullivan," Kate greeted, trying to be friendly despite their last tense encounter. Jack nodded, looking at the flowers. "The garden is looking beautiful," he said quietly. There was an uncomfortable silence before Jack spoke again. "Mrs. Ross." "Kate, I wanted to apologize for the other day. I wasn't very receptive to your ideas." Kate was surprised by the change in attitude. "It's okay, Pastor. We all have tough days." Jack swallowed hard. "It's just, since Sarah, my wife, passed away, it's been hard. Sometimes, I wonder if God really listens." Kate felt a wave of compassion. "I'm sorry for your loss, Jack. I can't imagine how difficult it must be." They continued talking, Kate listening as Jack shared his doubts and fears. When he left, Kate felt that perhaps they had reached a better understanding. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Kate found herself browsing on her computer. She typed, "Caroline Winters." She knew she shouldn't be doing this, that it was invading Evelyn's privacy, but something drove her. After hours of searching, Kate found a Caroline Winters living in a nearby town. Was she Evelyn's daughter? Why never visited? Kate was so absorbed in her thoughts that she almost didn't hear the knock on the door. It was Sarah, the nurse, looking worried. Kate, I just received an email from the board of directors. They're planning a surprise visit next week. Kate felt her stomach sink. What? But we're not ready. Sarah handed her a printed copy of the email. The words jumped off the page. If there are no significant improvements, we will be forced to consider closing the meadows. Kate felt panic rising. Thank you for letting me know, Sarah. I'll handle this. As soon as Sarah left, Kate slumped in her chair. The pressure to save the meadows, Evelyn's secret, her own past guilt, everything seemed to be collapsing on her. Tears began to fall. Kate covered her face with her hands, sobbing quietly. How could she do this? How could she save a place that had been sinking for years? Images of her mother in the hospital returned, mixing with visions of Evelyn in the garden and the residents of the meadows. The guilt of having abandoned her mother seemed to suffocate her. I can't do this, she whispered to herself. I'm not strong enough. For a long time, Kate sat there, letting the emotions flow. When she finally lifted her head, hours had passed. The sun was rising, casting a soft light through the window. Outside, in the garden, she could see Evelyn already standing, quietly tending to the plants. The sight of the elderly woman, so fragile yet so determined, touched something in Kate. Wiping away the tears, Kate stood up. Maybe she wasn't strong enough on her own, but she wasn't alone, was she? She had Evelyn, the other residents, the staff. Even Pastor Jack, with all his own struggles. With a deep breath, Kate straightened her shoulders. She had 1 week to prove that the meadows deserved to be saved. And she would do it, no matter what. Opening the office door, Kate stepped out to face a new day, determined to fight for the future of the meadows and, perhaps, find redemption for herself in the process. Weeks passed and the garden at the meadows began to come to life. Colorful flowers sprouted everywhere, filling the air with their sweet scent. The residents spent more time outdoors, their faces illuminated by the sun and smiles. The transformation did not go unnoticed by the community. Neighbors stopped to admire the garden, some even offering to help. Kate felt a spark of hope growing inside her. One sunny afternoon, Kate found Jack in the garden, watering some roses. He smiled when he saw her, a gesture she noticed was becoming more frequent. I thought I'd lend a hand, he said, wiping sweat from his brow. Kate smiled back. Every bit of help is welcome. Would you like me to show you how to prune the bushes? They worked side by side, talking about plants and life. Kate realized she enjoyed Jack's company, his presence bringing a sense of comfort she hadn't felt in a long time. Suddenly, a sharp scream cut through the air. It was Evelyn, standing at the garden gate, staring fixedly at Kate. Caroline! Caroline, you've come back! Evelyn shouted, running towards Kate with open arms. Kate froze, not sure how to react. Jack quickly positioned himself between them, gently holding Evelyn by the shoulders. Mrs. Winters, it's okay. It's Kate, remember? The director, Jack, spoke softly. Evelyn blinked several times, the confusion evident in her eyes. But I saw it. Caroline. Kate's heart tightened. The mention of Caroline brought back her secret research. She had found a Caroline Winters in the neighboring town but had not yet mustered the courage to make contact. Later, alone in her office, Kate stared at Caroline's phone number. Her finger hovered over the dial button, trembling slightly. With a sigh, she hung up the phone. She wasn't ready. Not yet. Outside, Jack walked through the garden, lost in thought. He found himself smiling as he remembered Kate earlier, the way she laughed, how her eyes sparkled when she talked about her plans for the meadows. But then, guilt hit him. Sarah, his late wife, seemed to look at him from every flower. How could he be developing feelings for another woman? "Forgive me, Sarah," he murmured to the wind, feeling torn between the past and a possible future. The sound of a car parking grabbed everyone's attention. A man in a suit stepped out, carrying a clipboard. Kate's stomach sank as she saw the Department of Health badge on his lapel. "Good afternoon," said the man, his voice serious. "I'm here for a surprise inspection." The next few hours were a blur of stress and anxiety. The inspector scoured every corner of the meadows, making notes and frowning. Finally, he called Kate for a private talk. "Mrs. Ross, I found several serious safety violations. Exposed wiring, expired fire extinguishers, inadequate hygiene procedures." Kate felt the blood drain from her face. "But we're working to improve." The garden dash. "The garden is beautiful," the inspector interrupted, "but it doesn't fix structural issues. I have to report this. The meadows may face heavy fines or even closure if these issues are not resolved immediately." When the inspector finally left, Kate felt utterly defeated. All the progress they had made seemed insignificant now. Jack found her sitting alone in the garden, silent tears streaming down her face. "Hey," he said softly, sitting beside her. "It'll be okay." Kate shook her head. "How? We don't have the money for all these repairs. I've failed, Jack. I've failed everyone here." Jack hesitated for a moment, then put his arm around her. Kate leaned into him, finding comfort in his embrace. "You haven't failed," Jack whispered. "You brought life back to this place. We'll find a way." They stayed like that for a long time, the scent of flowers around them, the distant sound of residents inside the house. Despite everything, Kate felt a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could get through this together. A severe storm hit the meadows overnight, causing significant damage to the newly revitalized garden. The next morning, Grace watched desolately as the destroyed flowers and fallen trees lay scattered. Determined not to let this setback shake her progress, Grace decided to reach out to Caroline. The phone conversation was tense and hostile, with Caroline refusing to talk about Evelyn or consider a visit. Shaken by Caroline's rejection, Grace found unexpected comfort in Jack. As they worked together to clear the garden debris, the tension between them grew, culminating in a near kiss interrupted by the sudden arrival of Ethan. That night, haunted by memories, Grace dreamed of the day she abandoned her own mother, reliving the guilt and regret. The next morning, Grace received an ultimatum from the board. She had 30 days to improve the finances of the meadows, or the home would be closed. With the garden destroyed and hopes dwindling, Grace found herself facing her greatest challenge yet. Grace knew she needed to act fast to save the meadows. With a flash of inspiration, she decided to organize a fundraising event in the garden that had cost so much effort to flourish. "Let's have a flower festival," she announced to the team. "We can sell plants, offer gardening workshops, and even have an auction of floral arrangements." The idea caught fire. Everyone at the meadows got involved in the preparations, from the most active residents to the staff. The enthusiasm was contagious, bringing new energy to the place. Evelyn was especially excited, spending hours in the garden preparing the flowers for the big day. But on the morning of the event, when Grace went to call her for breakfast, she found the elderly woman pale and weak in her bed. "Evelyn, what's wrong?" Grace asked, alarmed. "Oh, dear, I think I overdid it a bit," Evelyn replied with a weak smile. "But don't worry, I'll be fine for the festival." Grace insisted that Evelyn rest, promising to keep her informed about everything. Evelyn's absence in the garden left a palpable void, reminding everyone how important she was. As Grace ran back and forth, organizing the final details, Jack pulled her aside into a quiet corner. "Grace, we need to talk," he said, his tone serious. Grace felt her heart race. "Now? We're in the middle of preparations." "It's important," Jack insisted. I have feelings for you, Grace. But there's something in your past you're not telling me. I can feel it." Grace froze. She wasn't expecting this confrontation, not today. "Jack, Before she could respond, they heard a growing murmur coming from the entrance to the garden. Grace turned and her heart nearly stopped. There, looking around in shock, was Caroline. Grace recognized her instantly from the photos she had found online. Caroline was the image of a younger Evelyn, with the same piercing blue eyes. "Can I help?" Grace asked, approaching hesitantly. Caroline turned to her, confused. I don't know why I came. I saw the advertisement for the festival and something pulled me here." Grace felt a mix of hope and apprehension. "Well, you're welcome. I'm Grace, the director of the Meadows. Your mother, Evelyn, lives here." At the mention of Evelyn, Caroline's face hardened. "My mother? She still talks about me?" Before Grace could reply, Jack approached. "What's happening here?" Grace took a deep breath. It was time for the truth. "Jack, this is Caroline, Evelyn's daughter." "Caroline, this is Pastor Jack." Jack's eyes widened in realization. "Evelyn's daughter? But she never visits?" Caroline finished, bitterly. "There are reasons for that." Grace felt she was losing control of the situation. "Please, Caroline, Evelyn would be so happy to see you." "She's not well today, but—" "No," Caroline interrupted sharply. "This was a mistake. I shouldn't have come." She turned to leave, but Jack gently held her arm. "Wait, please. You came here for a reason. Give it a chance." Caroline hesitated, looking at the blossoming garden. For a moment, Grace saw a flicker of emotion in her eyes. Maybe I can take a quick look," Caroline murmured. As Caroline walked through the garden, Grace pulled Jack aside. She knew she owed him an explanation. "Jack, there's something I need to tell you," she began, her voice trembling. 5 years ago, I abandoned my mother. She had Alzheimer's, and I couldn't handle it. I ran and never looked back." Jack was silent for a long moment. "Is that why you're so invested in helping Evelyn and the others?" he finally asked. Grace nodded, tears in her eyes. "I'm trying to make amends, Jack. I know it's selfish, but—" Jack surprised her by pulling her into a hug. "It's not selfish to want to fix your mistakes, Grace. It's human." At that moment, they heard a scream from the house. It was Evelyn, who had gotten out of bed and was standing on the porch, looking directly at Caroline. "Caroline? Is that you, my daughter?" Evelyn called, her voice weak but full of emotion. Caroline turned, her face a mask of conflict. For a moment, it seemed she would walk towards her mother. But then, with one last anguished look, she turned and ran out of the garden. Grace wanted to follow her, but Evelyn needed her now. Rushing to the porch, she embraced the elderly woman, who was trembling and crying. She was here, wasn't she? Evelyn sobbed. My Caroline was here. Yes, Evelyn, Grace replied softly. She was. And I'm sure she'll come back. As the festival continued around them, a success despite the drama, Grace found herself torn between the joy of the event and the pain of witnessing the frustrated reunion between mother and daughter. Looking at Jack, who was taking care of Evelyn with kindness, Grace felt a mix of gratitude and fear. She had revealed her deepest secret, and now she could only hope that it wouldn't change how he saw her. The day ended with more questions than answers, but Grace knew that somehow they had taken an important step. The garden had blossomed, bringing not just beauty but also the promise of healing for long-buried wounds. In the weeks following the flower festival, the Meadows experienced a significant improvement in its finances. The event not only raised substantial funds but also attracted community attention, resulting in more donations and volunteers. Grace should have been celebrating, but she felt drained. The weight of responsibilities, combined with recent emotional dramas, left her exhausted. Every morning was a struggle to get out of bed and face another day. To make matters worse, Jack seemed to be distancing himself. Since Grace revealed her past, he had become distant, avoiding being alone with her. Grace caught him looking at her with a confused expression, as if trying to solve a complicated puzzle. On a particularly difficult afternoon, Grace went to find Evelyn in her room. The elderly woman was sitting near the window, staring blankly at the garden. "How are you feeling today, Evelyn?" Grace asked gently. Evelyn turned, her piercing blue eyes. "Grace, dear, I need to know. What happened with Caroline? Was she really here?" Grace felt a knot in her stomach. She had hoped Evelyn had forgotten that painful moment. "Yes, Evelyn. She was here on the day of the festival." "Then why didn't she come to see me? Why did she leave?" Evelyn's voice trembled with emotion. Grace held the old woman's hand, feeling guilty for not having all the answers. "I don't know, Evelyn. But I promise I'll try to find out." Determined to keep her promise, Grace decided to make another attempt to contact Caroline. After several unreturned calls, she finally managed to arrange a meeting in a cafe in town. Caroline arrived late, looking nervous and defensive. "What do you want?" she asked brusquely as soon as she sat down. Grace took a deep breath. "I want to understand, Caroline. Why don't you talk to your mother? She misses you so much." Caroline laughed bitterly. "My mother? The one who abandoned me when I needed her most?" Grace was shocked. Abandoned? But Evelyn never mentioned. "Of course not," Caroline interrupted. "She probably doesn't even remember. I was 18, had just been accepted to art school. My mother was furious, said I was throwing my life away. We had a terrible fight, and she kicked me out. Told me if I walked out that door, I didn't need to come back." Grace felt her heart tighten, recalling her own story of abandonment. "Caroline, I'm sorry. I had no idea." "No, you didn't," Caroline said, softening slightly. "No one knows. I spent years trying to understand why my own mother couldn't support me. And now it's too late. Grace wanted to say more, offer some comfort, but Caroline was already standing up to leave. "Please, don't contact me again," she said before walking out. Back at the Meadows, Grace was stunned by an emergency board meeting. Robert, one of the most influential board members, had a proposal that made Grace's blood run cold. "Ladies and gentlemen," Robert began, his voice oozing false concern. "We know the Meadows has been struggling. I have a solution: sell to Sunrise Senior Living Corporation. They have the resources to make the necessary improvements and turn this into a soulless business." Grace interrupted, furious. "The Meadows is not just a place, it's people, it's lives." The discussion that followed was heated, with opinions divided. In the end, it was decided that they would have a week to consider the proposal before a final vote. Grace left the meeting feeling defeated. She wandered through the garden, her mind a whirlwind of worries. It was then that she heard a muffled sob coming from behind a bush. She found Ethan crouched down, crying quietly. "Ethan! What's wrong, honey?" The boy looked up at her, his eyes red and teary. I miss Daddy, Mom. Why can't he be here with us?" Grace's heart broke. In her rush to save the Meadows, she had neglected her own son's emotional needs. She hugged him tightly, letting her own tears fall. "Oh, Ethan, I'm so sorry. I know it's been hard. I promise we'll spend more time together, okay?" As she comforted her son, Grace realized how fragile everything she was trying to build was. The Meadows, her relationship with Jack, Ethan's well-being, Evelyn and Caroline's reconciliation, everything seemed to be hanging by a thread. That night, lying in her bed, Grace wondered if she had the strength to keep fighting. The garden outside, which once symbolized hope and renewal, now seemed like a cruel reminder of all her failures. But as sleep finally enveloped her, a small voice inside her whispered, "Tomorrow is another day. And flowers always bloom again, no matter how hard the winter." Dawn brought a devastating discovery to the Meadows. Grace, during her morning rounds in the garden, noticed strange spots on the leaves of the plants. With a heavy heart, she approached to examine them more closely. "Oh no," she whispered, recognizing the signs of an aphid infestation. The pests had already spread throughout much of the garden, threatening to destroy months of hard work. As Grace assessed the damage, she heard heavy footsteps approaching. Turning around, she found Caroline, whose eyes blazed with anger. "You!" Caroline shouted, pointing an accusing finger at Grace. "How dare you meddle in my life?" Grace stepped back, surprised by the sudden appearance. "Caroline, No! You don't have the right," Caroline interrupted. "After we met, you called my aunt. You told her about my mother, about our fight. How could you?" Grace felt the blood drain from her face. She had, indeed, contacted Caroline's aunt, hoping to better understand the situation. She never imagined it would cause so much pain. "I'm sorry, Caroline. I was only trying to help," Grace tried to explain. "Help? You're manipulating the situation," Caroline yelled, her words echoing through the garden. At that moment, Jack appeared, drawn by the shouting. He said nothing but positioned himself silently beside Grace, offering tacit support. The argument continued, with Caroline pouring out years of hurt and resentment. Grace tried to defend herself, explain her intentions, but each word seemed only to make things worse. Suddenly, a sharp scream cut through the air. Everyone turned to see Evelyn standing at the garden gate, shaking violently. "Caroline? Is that you, my daughter?" Evelyn called out, her voice frail and broken. Caroline froze, her face pale at the sight of her mother for the first time in years. "Mom?" Evelyn took a step forward, reaching out a trembling hand. But before she could reach Caroline, her eyes rolled back, and she collapsed on the ground. "Evelyn!" Grace cried out, rushing to assist the elderly woman. The next few minutes were a blur of frantic activity. An ambulance was called, Evelyn was rushed to the hospital, and Caroline disappeared in the chaos. Hours later, Grace sat alone in her office, exhausted and emotionally drained. The phone rang, startling her. "Hello," she answered, her voice hoarse. "Gracie? Is that you, dear?" Grace's heart stopped. It was the voice of her mother, the one she had abandoned years ago. "Mom," she whispered, hardly believing. "Oh, Gracie, I finally found you. I wanted to say that I forgive you, dear. Please, come home." Her mother's words were like daggers to Grace's heart. The guilt she had buried for so long surged to the surface, leaving her breathless. "Mom, I can't talk right now. I need to go," Grace stammered, hanging up the phone with trembling hands. She barely had time to process the call when Sarah, the nurse, burst into the office. "Grace, the board is meeting now. They're voting on the sale of the meadows." Grace ran to the meeting room, her heart pounding in her chest. She opened the door just as Robert, the board member who proposed the sale, announced the result. With 5 votes in favor and 4 against, the proposal to sell the meadows to Sunrise Senior Living Corporation has been approved. The room exploded into a mix of applause and protests. Grace stood at the door, stunned, feeling as if the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. Jack approached her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Grace, I'm sorry," he murmured. Grace looked at him, then at the board members, at the staff who were gathering at the door. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions: anger, sadness, guilt, fear. Outside, the once vibrant garden was dying, consumed by aphids. Evelyn was in the hospital. Caroline had disappeared again. Her own mother had found her, only to be rejected once more. And now, the meadows, the place she had fought so hard to save, was about to be sold and transformed into something unrecognizable. Grace felt the weight of all these failures on her shoulders. She looked at Jack, at Sarah, at everyone around her. "It's over," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "I failed all of you." With those words, Grace turned and walked out of the room, leaving a stunned silence behind. She walked down the corridor, past the infested garden, and kept walking, not knowing where she was going, just knowing she needed to escape. The sun set on the horizon, casting long shadows over the meadows. Grace wondered if this was the end of everything she had fought for, or if there was still a chance, however small, for redemption. The hospital corridors seemed endless as Grace rushed towards the ICU. The doctor's words over the phone still echoed in her mind: "Evelyn suffered a stroke. She's in critical condition." As she rounded the corner, Grace came face to face with Caroline, who was sitting in a chair, her face pale and her eyes red from crying. For a moment, the two women just stared at each other in silence. "What are you doing here?" Caroline asked, her voice hoarse. Grace took a deep breath. "Evelyn is important to me, Caroline. I care about her." Caroline stood up, anger replacing sadness on her face. "You care?" You barely know her. I'm her daughter. A daughter who abandoned her. Grace shot back, her own frustration boiling over. The words hung in the air, cutting deep. Caroline advanced, her fists clenched. You know nothing about me or my mother. Before the situation could escalate further, Jack stepped in between them. Stop, please, he said firmly. This isn't going to help Evelyn. Jack looked from Grace to Caroline, his expression serious. You're both hurt, I get it. But right now, Evelyn needs you. She needs love, not arguments. Jack's words seemed to penetrate the fog of anger enveloping the two women. Caroline slumped back into her chair, sobbing. Grace, feeling ashamed, leaned against the wall. Caroline, Jack said gently, your mother made mistakes, just like you. But she loves you. Every day at the Meadows, she talked about you. Turning to Grace, he continued, and Grace, you need to understand there are stories and pains you don't know about. We can't judge. The following hours were a silent vigil. Grace and Caroline, though not speaking directly, stayed side by side, united in their concern for Evelyn. When they were finally allowed to see Evelyn, the sight of the frail elderly woman connected to tubes and machines was a shock for both. Caroline held her mother's hand, whispering apologies between tears. Grace watched the scene, her heart heavy. She knew she needed to give space for mother and daughter to reconnect. Returning to the Meadows the next morning, Grace was greeted by a sight that took her breath away. The garden, once vibrant and full of life, was completely destroyed. Plants uprooted, flower beds overturned, the small fountain shattered. Sarah, the nurse, ran up to her. It happened overnight, she explained, her voice trembling. We think it was vandals. Grace walked slowly through what remained of the garden, each step crushing her heart a little more. All the hard work, all the hopes they had placed in this place, all destroyed. At that moment, something inside Grace broke. She returned to her small apartment and began packing her bags. She couldn't continue any longer. She had failed Evelyn, the residents, everyone. As she threw clothes into a suitcase, Grace heard a soft knock at the door. It was Ethan, her son, looking at her with wide, frightened eyes. Mom, what are you doing? He asked. We're leaving, honey, Grace replied, avoiding her son's gaze. I tried, but it didn't work out. We need to start over somewhere else. Ethan was silent for a moment, then said something that made Grace stop. But what about Mrs. Evelyn? And Jack? And everyone else? We can't just abandon them. Grace turned to face her son, surprised by the maturity in his voice. Mom, Ethan continued, you always told me not to give up when things get tough. The Meadows needs you. Mrs. Evelyn needs you. Ethan's words hit Grace like a lightning bolt. She looked at the half-packed suitcases, at her determined son, and felt a wave of shame wash over her. How could she teach Ethan about perseverance and then run away at the first sign of difficulty? Oh, Ethan, she whispered, pulling him into a tight hug. You're right. We can't give up. In that moment, looking into her son's eyes, Grace felt a spark of hope rekindle in her chest. Maybe not everything was lost. Maybe, with love and determination, there was still a chance to save the Meadows, to help Evelyn, to fix everything that was broken. Let's fight, she said, her voice gaining strength. Let's fight for the Meadows, for Evelyn, for all of them. Ethan smiled, the first genuine smile Grace had seen on his face in weeks. Together, mother and son began unpacking the suitcases, each piece of clothing returned to the closet symbolizing their renewed commitment. Outside, winter was approaching, threatening to cover everything with its chill. But inside that small apartment, a flame of hope and determination had been lit, promising to warm even the coldest of hearts. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity for Grace. With renewed determination, she rallied the community, the staff, and even Caroline to help rebuild the meadows, both physically and emotionally. Jack, seeing the change in Grace, stepped up as well, offering his unwavering support. Together, they started planning a community event, not just to raise funds, but to heal and unite everyone who had been affected by the recent troubles. Meanwhile, Evelyn slowly recovered, her strength growing each day. She was moved by the outpouring of support from everyone, especially from her daughter, Caroline, who spent every possible moment by her side. One chilly morning, as the first buds of spring appeared, the meadows was once again bustling with activity. People from all over the town came to help plant new flowers, repaint the benches, and restore the fountain. Grace watched, her heart swelling with pride and hope. The garden was coming back to life, and with it, the entire community seemed to be blossoming. During the event, Grace took a moment to address the crowd. "Thank you, everyone," she began, her voice steady and clear. "This garden is a symbol of our resilience, our ability to come back even stronger after adversity. We are not just rebuilding a place, we are strengthening a community." As applause broke out, Grace felt a hand on her shoulder. It was Caroline, who had transformed from a reluctant participant into an enthusiastic supporter. "You were right," Caroline whispered. "This place, it's worth fighting for." Jack joined them, his smile bright. "Looks like the meadows has more life in it yet," he said, gesturing to the crowd of laughing children and chatting adults. That afternoon, as the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the newly planted garden, Grace and Jack found themselves alone, walking among the rows of fresh flowers. "I owe you an apology," Jack said suddenly. "I doubted you, Grace. I thought you were running away from your problems, but I was wrong. You were facing them head on, and you taught me to do the same." Grace looked at him, her eyes reflecting the sunset. "We all have our moments of doubt, Jack. What matters is how we recover, how we grow from them." Jack nodded, taking a deep breath. "And now that the meadows is safe, what about us? Is there a chance for something more?" Grace felt her heart skip a beat. The past months had shown her just how much she valued Jack's presence in her life. "I'd like that," she said softly. "I think we've both earned a chance at happiness." Hand in hand, they walked back towards the gathering, their steps light and hopeful. The garden was vibrant with colors, each flower a testament to the community's effort and love. Children ran past them, laughing and playing, their joy infectious. Evelyn, now sitting up in her wheelchair, caught Grace's eye and smiled. Beside her, Caroline stood, her arm protectively around her mother. It was a perfect picture of reconciliation and new beginnings. As the day ended, Grace felt a deep sense of peace. The meadows was more than a place of care, it was a home, a sanctuary for those who needed it most. And she was proud to be its guardian. Looking around, she knew that the true spring had arrived, not just for the garden, but for all their hearts. With love, perseverance, and a little bit of faith, they had turned the darkest winter into the brightest spring.